So the second keynote session for our conference. In this session, we'll be focusing on a critical theme of putting the user front and center of planning for walking. And this is an approach that is increasingly vital in our effort to create a more sustainable and livable communities. Without much ado, let me share a bit about our keynote speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Kate Mackay. As a technical director of strategic planning at Mott MacDonald in Brisbane, Australia, Kate brings over 25 years of experience in transport planning, during which she has held a range of senior leadership and technical roles. Kate is renowned for her ability to deliver innovative and creative solutions to complex transport planning and policy challenges with a particular expertise in behaviour change. Among her many accomplishments are leading the Australian transport planning practice, serving as the strategy lead for the Think Change program on the Sunshine Coast, and advising the Queensland government on vision-led planning in the face of uncertainty. She is a passionate advocate for a user-centered approach to infrastructure design and development. Kate holds an MSc in Transport from Imperial College London and a Bachelor's in Geography from Newcastle University. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished keynote speaker, Kate Mackay. Kate, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Matilda. That's brilliant. And how fabulous is this? Your inaugural Transformative Transport Conference. So pleased to be taking part. Thank you so much, Emmanuel, for inviting me. So how we put the user front and center of planning for walking is something that's been front of mind for me and many of my colleagues for a long time. And it's great to be able to share some thoughts and some practical insights with you all today on how we might be able to do this better. So I'm going to give an overview of travel behaviour and how people make choices about transport, which for me is the essential building blocks for considering how we plan for walking. Then I'll present the design thinking framework and outline how it can be used to enable people to put the user front and centre when you're planning for walking or doing any transport planning. Following from this, I'll share some examples from Australia, from New Zealand and from the United Kingdom of how these design thinking techniques have been put into practice in projects that are designed, at least in part, to encourage walking. And this will include comment on the use of design thinking techniques like personas, engagement methods like how might we, observational analysis, and my personal favourite, something called worst possible idea. And I want to note before I start that everything I'm talking to you about today is the product of thinking from the local and global teams, which I'm privileged to work with at Mott MacDonald. And I particularly wanted to single out a colleague in New Zealand called Hamish Speakman, who's been pivotal to a lot of this work. Before I get started, I did want to read out an acknowledgement of country. I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country throughout Australia and their connections to land, to water and to community. I'm joining you today from Meanjin, which is otherwise known to most people as Brisbane, and it's the land of the Yugara and the Turrbal people. And I believe these lands were never ceded, and therefore they always were and always will be Aboriginal land. So I'd really like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today. Before we launch into thinking about travel behaviour, I think it's helpful to reflect on how important lived experience.
So many of us have a story about how we got into transport planning, and I was commenting on how I think lived experiences are really important. So for me, the experience that I always reflect on is the time that I spent living and working in Kuala Lumpur. So after I graduated with a geography degree from university, I went to work there, and it was a time of huge growth in the city, and I absolutely loved it. But I was travelling into work every day in an architect's practice, and I found myself complaining on a daily basis about how difficult it was to get around on foot and by bus, and how dangerous, how dirty, how inconvenient and how challenging it was. And I was regularly speculating about what I could do about it. And so I left and I went to do a master's in transport at Imperial College and at UCL. And fast forward 25 years with time spent living and working in India and Fiji and New Zealand, South Africa and Australia. I'm really very much of the view that the key to planning for walking lies not only in an integrated approach to planning for better communities, cities, places to live, work and play, but also in this much, much deeper understanding of our customers and who we are planning for. So how do we do this? Well, first of all, I think we really need to get a bit introspective. We need to recognise that the way we as transport professionals make decisions about things, about planning for walking, can often be the product of multiple cognitive biases, and we need to work really hard to stay aware of that. Now, you'll all know, I'm sure, what a cognitive bias is. You know, it's an error in our thinking when we're trying to process and make sense of the information in the world around us. And often it's a result of our brains trying to simplify all that information, you know, trying to make sense of the world and make a decision quickly. And we rely on our knowledge and our experience that we've acquired over the years. And when you're making judgment and decisions, you like to think that you're logical. You like to think that you're capable of understanding all the information that's available and presented to you. But sometimes our biases really do fool us, and they lead us to making poor conclusions and actions, even without realizing it. And the image that you see on the screen there is it's a very, very busy image, but it does show what we think we know now about the number of cognitive biases that affect our thinking, over 200 of them. And I wanted to highlight too that on a day-to-day basis, I like to remain aware of, because I think they do impact on the decisions that we make as transport planners. And the first one of those is confirmation bias. So this is where we actively seek out and favour information which confirms our opinion, and we disregard information that contradicts it. So, you know, you think about making a decision about how to improve a potential route for people walking, and we might inadvertently look for information that supports our beliefs about why people aren't walking along this route, and fail to see information that presents different ideas. And the other one that is often quite worth bearing in mind is what we call the anchoring effect. So this is a bias that describes our tendency to rely too heavily on the first piece of information that you're offered, so that the anchor. And it's the tendency to jump to conclusions and base your final judgment on that information that you gained right early in the decision-making process. And I think we all, you know, we can all remember a situation where we've done that. Once we've got an initial piece of information, we find it really hard to change our mind. So, you know, we need to be aware of our flaws, our biases. We need to try and think slowly as often we can. And we need to be data-driven, so really understanding our customers and our users. Once we're comfortable accepting that, and that's quite a big thing, comfortable accepting that we have biases, I think there's another hard truth that we need to face up to. So yes, we're talking about walking, and we're talking about, you know, getting more people walking more often, but it's not all about transport. Most of the time, most of us don't travel for travel's sake. We travel to get somewhere, to do something, to access some good or some service. So as we all will probably know, travel is what we call a derived demand. COVID has really shone a light on how this access that we need, that we desire, doesn't need to involve us travelling. So it can be provided by transport, but also by having things close to where we live. So through land use planning or spatial proximity. It can be through our online means and digital connectivity, like Zoom meetings and Teams chats when your headphones don't stop working halfway through, you know, or streaming a video rather than going to the cinema, ordering Uber rather than walking to the pizza outlet to get your takeaway. And the point is that we all live in what we call a triple access system, and we really need to recognise that in all our planning. The third thing that I think we need to recognise is that our lives, our customer lives, our people's lives, the people that we are designing for are really messy. The way we make decisions about travel or access, about walking or not walking, those decision-making processes are just messy because our lives are really complex and intertwined. And this is one of my favourite slides, for which I have to credit a good colleague for Glenn Lyons. He's our Mott MacDonald Professor of Future Mobility. And the reality is that the decisions that we make about travel and transport, the decisions we make about walking, are usually made unknowingly, subconsciously on autopilot. And they're made on the basis of reducing the cognitive effort of a journey. So once we've found something that works for us, we tend to stick to it. So on a day-to-day basis, travel and transport isn't something that we think about unless we're prompted to. We have our routines, we have our habits, and we stick to them. Many trips are no big deal so long as they work out. And frankly, we've all got plenty of other things to occupy our mind. So we are much more like Homer Simpson than we are like Spock. And the other is another quote that I tend to use a lot when I'm trying to sort of remind myself as to how our brains work, and it comes from a chap called Rory Sutherland, who is co-author of what I think is an excellent book called Transport for Humans. And what he says is the human mind doesn't run on logic any more than a horse runs on petrol, and I think that really captures it for me. So characterising the complexity and the messiness of people's daily routines is really difficult. And I certainly find in our work that a model can help. So for the modelers on the call, this is not a modeler's model, but it's a multi-factor conceptual model of choice making. And it's the model that you see on the screen. So this was developed through our work in Australia and in New Zealand. It was based on research that we analysed during various literature reviews, and it demonstrates how people's choice making is influenced by, and so we can consider it by, factors at what we've called the macro level, the meso level, and the micro level. And we use it regularly now in all our work to ensure we're capturing all those aspects of choice making, so particularly when we're planning for walking. So the macro factors are associated with the structure of the environment. They're the attributes of the physical environment or other structural elements of society. And that touches on those three subsystems of the triple axis system. The meso factors are related to the structure of people's lives and day-to-day activities. So that includes the attributes of trips, activities, practices that influence how we access the things we need. So it touches on considerations in life stage, lifestyles, competency, as well as social and cultural norms. And the micro factors relates to personal issues, the things that are about the individual, their personal or their behavioural characteristics and their preferences. Also considers the role of household factors in decision making and brings in a bit of psychology and behavioural economics. And they're all related. So if you think, for example, about walking to work, trying to encourage someone to walk to work. So research, we know suggests that the presence of well-maintained footpaths, so dedicated pedestrian infrastructure, which is a macro factor, can shape social norms and competency around walking to work, which is a meso factor. And then people's personal feelings, a micro factor, towards other people who walk. So changes in people's personal feelings can shape the social norms about walking to work, and that can translate into a community support for new infrastructure. So any of the design we do, we're always trying to think about these three elements of what is driving people's decision making. And then to complement that understanding of behaviour, to help us consistently put the user front and centre, we need a methodology, and the methodology that we're now using a lot to structure our work, particularly when we are looking at developing initiatives for active transport for walking, is called the double diamond. So, and it's design thinking. So some of you may have seen this before, called the double diamond because you can see there's two diamond-shaped things there. It's not very common in transport or transport planning, though. If you've come from a design background, you might be more familiar with it. This image was created by the UK Design Council in 2004. So what is it? Well, it's a flexible, iterative, non-linear, human-centered approach to understanding users. And the point is for us that by using design thinking, we are supported in making decisions based on what customers need, rather than relying on historical data or, you know, even kind of making bets based on instinct. Now, we're not purist about how we use this internally. We've taken the concept and we've adapted it for transport planning, but we do find it really useful in putting the user front and center. So I'll just give you a quick overview of what it means and how it works. So you take the first diamond, and that's referred to as the problem space, and the second diamond is referred to as the solution space. And each diamond consists of divergent thinking, so opening up, and convergent thinking, which is closing down. And there are 4 phases in design thinking. So the first phase is called discover, and this is the user-focused research phase. And this is all about divergent thinking or opening out. So all ideas and information are considered and included. And this is where we accommodate uncertainty, because at this point, we don't really have a clear idea about the problem. And the purpose is to collect as much information as possible about an issue or a challenge affecting users. Then we move into the define phase, otherwise called the synthesis phase. So this is where we start closing down. It's convergent thinking, and we start filtering out the most important insights gained from that discover phase. And the purpose, as the name implies, is to narrow down the ideas into a definition of the key problems for the user and to contextualize the root causes of the problem. Why are they occurring? What's stopping us from addressing them? And this is where we might build themes, find insights, develop personas, form how might we statements, things that I'll touch on in a little bit. Then you move into stage 3, which is the develop, and this is the ideation phase. So you've now got a more clearly defined problem. This is all about thinking about the ways in which that problem could be solved. So it's divergent thinking again. And through that process of developing solutions, you might find that there's additional problems or pieces of information that that need kind of revisiting. So this is a lot of brainstorming and using some really fun techniques like the worst possible idea that I mentioned before, and also the development of customer journey maps, which I'll touch on later. And then phase 4, deliver. So this is the implementation phase. So this is where we take and test and prototype the solutions and identify what's the best solution to the problem. So it's converging. And whilst you've only got 2 diamonds shown here, the reality is you can open up and close down as many times as you need to capture that complexity of the problem and the best solutions to addressing them. So in the next couple of slides, I'm going to show you some of the ways in which we've used some design thinking techniques in projects around the world to really try and get the user front and center. So I'm going to start by taking most of you probably over to the other side of the world, to where I'm sitting, to Queensland and to the Gold Coast in Australia. So this is the land of the Turrbal and the Yagara peoples and the Kombumerri families of the Yugamba language region. It's home to about 650,000 people, and the population is forecast to increase to about 1 million by 2041. It's a very linear pattern of development on the Gold Coast, no clear centre, and partially, as significantly as a consequence of that, nearly 90% of trips are by car. Women, young people, older people have quite different travel and access patterns, and if you haven't been to the Gold Coast, the beaches do look quite like that. We were commissioned by the City of Gold Coast to work with them to develop a next generation transport strategy. So Transport Strategy 2041 for the whole Gold Coast region. And given the challenges that the region is facing with that number of trips by car, walking along with other sustainable transport was a fundamental consideration of the strategy. And we used design thinking to frame the whole project. So what you see on the screen here is our project methodology. So as I said, we actually structured the entire project, a 2-year project pretty much, around the double diamond design thinking. And you can see the questions that we posed at each stage in that process. And that really kept us on track to making sure we kept the user front and center. We lived and breathed this sort of opening out and closing down of design thinking across the whole development of the strategy. As part of the development of the strategy, we undertook a really intensive period of listening to people who lived, who worked, who played on the Gold Coast, and we had a number of online communities, so like online focus groups. We did do separate telephone-based engagement for people who have low vision, and we structured those online communities around that macro, meso, micro model that I showed you earlier. And then we used the insights, really rich insights from those sessions, to develop some personas. And you can see those on the screen. If you click on that link when you get the slides, you can actually see them on the Gold Coast City Council webpage. So personas are key in design thinking. They're key because they support empathy and they support a user focus, because they allow us to set aside our own assumptions about the world, our own biases, and to gain real insights into users and their needs. So each persona is essentially a storytelling tool, and if they're done correctly, they can be a really powerful tool for illustrating different mindsets. So personas aren't real people, but they are grounded in reality. So they should look like someone that you can imagine in the situation or the context that you're designing for. Personas are much more common in transport planning now, which is brilliant, but I think there still needs to be quite a bit of care taken in how they're used and how they're presented. The personas we developed form the starting point for unpacking and defining the challenges for the transport strategy, and they were then vital for us in the solution phase for refining the transport strategy and the specific policy responses. And to make really sure we transferred the user to the heart of our planning, we developed for each persona what we call a day in the life of customer journey map. So this might be, if you're familiar with customer journey maps, you might not be familiar with this type of customer journey map. What this does is this takes a really broad view. So it examines everything a persona does during their day. It illustrates what people do, what they think, what they feel on a particular day. And it helps uncover pain points in a user's life. It helps highlight unmet needs, which could be addressed. And we found these customer journey maps to be incredibly powerful in communicating to all our stakeholders the challenges and the issues faced by people on the Gold Coast. And it allowed the city to develop the personas into something that they use now in all their customer-facing engagement. And we used in the transport strategy for stress testing all the policy initiatives that we were proposing, which, as I said at the beginning, was a lot about sustainable travel initiatives. Next, I want to take you from Australia, short hop across the Tasman Sea to New Zealand, and to a project that we delivered recently for Kainga. So this is the New Zealand state-owned housing authority, and they have responsibility as well for leading urban regeneration projects. So in a project that was led by them with the New Zealand Transport Agency, Auckland Transport and Hobsonville Residents Society, we were tasked with developing a plan for the Hobsonville Point community that would encourage people to reduce the amount that they use their car and potentially walk instead. The whole area, if you ever get the opportunity to go to New Zealand, is really worth a visit. It's been, master planned from the bottom up. Really wide footpath. It's designed for walking and cycling, and on the healthy streets indicators, it would score really well. And generally, people that live there are very engaged. They're very supportive of sustainable travel. And one of the aims of the project was to get people to come up with their own ideas to encourage them to walk. So we proposed and we undertook a design thinking engagement technique that I've referred to already called How Might We? So how might we is a technique that you can use to try and identify what the root cause is for a behaviour, and then to identify what the key challenges might be that you then take forward into the solution space. One of the proponents of design thinking is a man called Ben Mazadeur, and when he's describing how might we, he uses this quote. Or he's quoted as saying this. He says, so he's talking about Albert Einstein. So when Einstein was asked what he would do with only 1 hour to save the world, Einstein said, I will spend 55 minutes defining the problem and then 5 minutes solving it. And that really gets to the heart of the purpose of the how might we techniques. So how might we statements are referred to as small and mighty questions that allow us to reframe our user insights about user needs into opportunity areas and innovate on the problems we found during user research. And a properly framed how might we doesn't suggest or imply a particular solution, but it just gives you that perfect frame for innovative thinking about what could resolve them. And the might is key because that supports the divergent thinking. And the we is also key because it means the process has got to involve co-creation with people responsible for implementing the solutions. So I'll just show you the how might we that we went through at Hobsonville Point. So how might we encourage people to walk or to ride a bike? And yes, we were, I think one of the fair criticisms of planning for walking is so often walking and riding get lumped in together. Unfortunately, that's just the way a lot of our clients see it. I do have my views on that, but this was the question: how might we encourage people to walk or ride a bike? So then the first question you pose when you're doing a how might we exercise is you say, well, why? Why should we address that problem? And here you have to channel your inner toddler and you have to pretend you're that really annoying 4-year-old, nagging whoever it is, saying, well, why should we do this? And why should we do that? So you have to say, well, why do we want to encourage people to walk or ride a bike? Well, because it might mean that people drive less. Why do we care if people drive less? Well, it will free up road space to allocate to other uses. Why do we care if we are going to free up road space to allocate to other users? Well, because it might allow us to create a more attractive environment that people want to live in. And you stop when you get to what Ben Mazadeur calls the ceiling of happiness and rainbows, but in other words, when you get to the point where you get those really, really broad benefits. And then you start going down. You say, well, what's stopping us encouraging people to walk or ride a bike? Well, in this particular circumstances, because using the private car is really easy. Well, what's stopping us addressing that? Why is it so easy? Well, the businesses are really in favour of having lots of parking. They want people. They think they need people to drive to get to their businesses. Well, what's stopping us addressing that? The current parking strategy, which enables free parking. So you stop where you get down to really narrow questions that start to sound like solutions, and the solution here, albeit maybe not happen, is let's have a look at the parking policy and can we change that? And then you can keep building out as well till you've captured all the main benefits and the reasons for what's stopping us. Okay, another quick reflection on another project in New Zealand. So this time where we were considering walking as part of a public transport trip. So the first mile, last mile to a proposed new bus station, working again for the New Zealand Transport Agency, wanting to understand people's experience of walking to the newly proposed bus interchange in order that we can make recommendations to make those walking trips easier, ultimately to ensure that that part of people's journey wasn't going to dissuade them from using the bus. So there's no substitute for listening to people, but experiencing the environment they inhabit in the way that they inhabit it is equally important, living their experience. And one way to do this is through observational research. And many people will consider this sort of the core of design thinking. So this is where, as a researcher, you immerse yourself in the same environment as the people or the situation you want to understand. So you observe how other people behave and you see things as other people see them. So it really helps reflect on our unconscious biases, and it helps to contextualize problems or barriers people have told us about. So it's a really simple concept, but so frequently we just don't take the time to do it. We say we can just sit at our desks and look at the routes on Google Earth without even leaving the office. So how does it work? Really simple: group of people, pre-arranged set of routes to walk, and a framework for collecting the data, which is what you can see on the screen there. So a standardized framework for it. Walk the length of both of the streets, both sides, and documenting anything that impacts on your walk. So things like, service covers lifted off, which creates a trip hazard. Cars parked on the inside of the footpath, gravel footpaths, big, heavy vehicles turning and making the walking environment very unpleasant. So, small things which you probably wouldn't notice if you were doing this at a desktop, small things that make a huge difference to the feel of that walking journey, that made a huge difference to our people who were walking that, and that would be absolutely critical to address if we wanted to encourage people to do that first mile, last mile bar walk. And Emmanuel, I've probably got 2 more minutes. So chipping through back to the United Kingdom now. So to the town of Carmarthen in Wales. So here we were commissioned to deliver a new approach to active travel improvements for the people of Carmarthen. And what was new about it? It was this user focus. So we started the process by facilitating 2 in-person focus groups with a set of locally recruited individuals, and that was to understand what mattered to people in Carmarthen. And we heard that loud and clear. We heard that they're very community-minded, they've got a really clear identity, very proud of their area, and they love getting out into nature, they like getting out and walking their dog. So following from this, we facilitated a co-design workshop where we brought in some personas that we had created from the focus groups, and we did a worst possible idea initiative, which was designed to get participants' views on how people in the town could be encouraged to walk a bit more. And this is how it works. So at the beginning, one of the challenges we all face with putting this greater focus on the user is our unconscious biases, our own assumptions about what the appropriate course of action is. And, pressure of our day-to-day jobs, sometimes it's really hard to think outside the box, to think creatively. And sometimes that can seem really daunting. We don't have the time for it. So what worst possible idea does is it lifts people out of the day-to-day. It helps get them thinking creatively. It supports people who are maybe not so confident in expressing themselves or not interested in expressing themselves. And it can reduce tension between stakeholders, particularly those who've had previously established and sometimes, kind of unmovable positions. So how does it work? Instead of going for good ideas and putting the pressure on, you ask for the worst ideas, and then you use them to develop the good ones. So it's so much easier to say, oh, that idea is not bad enough, than the opposite. You've got the bad ideas, you collaboratively turn them into good ideas. So this was one of the ones we had. How might we get students to walk from the university to the cinema? Well, we could get their parents to hide their car keys in the morning so that they literally can't drive. Well, what's good with that? The students are encouraged to consider travelling differently, but forcing them is not a good idea. So what might a solution be? Well, maybe some sort of incentive that encourages them to leave their car keys in their cars at home. So some very quick final thoughts. This image is from a recent trip to Lisbon, and I think it captures the essence of the way in which we need to think when we are talking about how we put the user front and centre of planning for walking, and how we need to think literally outside the box. So this customer wanted to walk home with their purchase, and then we're going to call an Uber because the vacuum cleaner they purchased was just too awkward a size to carry home. But what turned out to be the solution was a very switched on salesperson, someone who was very confident tying knots, who had some string, who suggested that they could tie a handle and so they could walk home with it instead. So I guess, to sum up, transport professionals, we know we need to put the customer first, but to do that, we have to understand the customer. Sometimes we don't do that very well. We just assume. We need to really recognise and remain alert to our biases. We need to understand how messy and complex people's lives are. We need to use frameworks where we think they're useful. We found design thinking helpful, might not work for everybody. And we need to keep learning and listening to what's happening across the world. And I'll leave it there. Thanks, Emmanuel.
Thank you very much, Kate, for this insightful session. In fact, it's a very interesting one, especially with how might we approach that you mentioned. It was a very good one. So the floor is open now for questions. If you have any question, kindly type in the chat box. And then